going to entail a lot of secular history tonight, and much of it is very obscure. Now, the first parts of it are not. So the first few verses were, it's very mainstream ancient secular history. But once we get into about verses 5 or 6, it's going to go off in all kinds of different directions. And well, fortunately, I think we should be able to follow along on the notes that I've included in the update for Daniel 11 notes for the secular history. And when we're not ready to put those up just yet, but we will be shortly. We left off at the end of chapter 10 and the beginning of chapter 11 last time. And when we get into verse 2, which is our starting point, because actually verse 1 should have really been a continuation of chapter 10. When we get into verse 2, we're already getting into some secular history there. And I'm shuffling my books here. I have too many books in front of me tonight. My place. Oh, there we go. Okay. We talk about 3 more Persian kings. Now, there's when Matt does put up the notes in a moment, you're going to see I have an asterisk by one of the names of the Persian kings. Now, there's a reason for that, and I'll explain that momentarily. But remember, when Daniel is receiving this prophecy, the Persian king in question, the Persian king in power is Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the First. And he was king of Persia from 559 BC roughly till 530 BC. So he's the man in control at that time. But verse 2 says 3 more Persian kings shall arise, and says the 4th shall be far richer than all, and shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Now, when we're talking about, we've got Cyrus, and then, okay, you can go ahead and put up those notes now, Matt, if you want, there. So after Cyrus the Great, and let's see here, we have to scroll up. We're actually too far down. We're at verse 5, we can go the other way. Yeah, there we go. That's the way. Nope, a little bit further. I wrote big this time that way, so I wouldn't need to put my glasses on to see them myself. So hopefully you can all see that. Okay, that's good. Okay, so Persian kings there, these are the ones that come into question. Now, what's interesting is that historically, I rarely even mention the one with the asterisk next to his name there, Smerdis, also known as Bardia. But if you count it, no matter how you count this, well, actually, he is important if you count on a 4th king. But Cambyses succeeded Cyrus the Great. And then at the death of Cambyses, this Smerdis, who was kind of an imposter king, perhaps, he claimed to be a brother of Cambyses, but that's not necessarily the case. He was kind of a phony king. He didn't last very long, but he's just almost like a footnote in history. Rather, there's not a whole lot to say about him other than he probably was an imposter. Nevertheless, he sat as king. So if you count, Cambyses is 1, because it says 3 more kings will arise, then Smerdis would be 2, phony or not. Darius would be 3. Now, it was during the reign of Darius that the Battle of the Marathon took place. And that was a very historic encounter between the city-state of Athens and the mighty Persian army. And of course, the Persian army was the largest in the world at that time. They had the world's largest empire at that time. And they were fighting with the Greeks originally because they feared that Athens was getting too strong by building their navy, so they wanted to send a message. The Persians in general were very tolerant of the people they were in power over, unless those people rebelled or unless they didn't pay their taxes, because they pretty much left everybody alone. But the Greeks, I like to compare them to like Americans, and like when we rebelled and we revolted to get our independence. The Greeks were very much a freedom-loving people. In fact, Athens, Greece was the birthplace of democracy. And so what you have here is a small group rebelling against the world's mightiest empire. Now, I know it's not exactly the same, but there's some similarities between our revolution against Great Britain, who was a mighty empire at that time, even though they were a very small nation themselves, and the Persian struggles against ancient Greece. Greece was a small portion, sort of attached to the Persian Empire. At any rate, the Battle of the Marathon took place during the reign of Darius, but his son was around to see that. Darius was near the end of his reign because the Battle of the Marathon took place in 490 BC. I want you to take note, after Darius the First, next is Xerxes, and he is that fourth king where it says, the fourth shall be far richer than all and shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. So keep that in mind as we scroll up. We're going to take a look at Persia versus Greece here just to demonstrate how right on this prophecy is. All right, so 490 BC was the Battle of the Marathon, and at that time, Darius was still the king. Now, some of you might be familiar with this story. This was one of the great upsets in military history. The city-state of Athens, once again, the birthplace of democracy, they had a very strong navy that they were building. However, on land, they were not nearly as large as the Persian army. Now, when the word came that the Persian army was invading, the Athenians immediately tried to get help from the most warlike of all the Greek city-states, and that was Sparta. But at that time, the Spartans were in the midst of a religious festival, and they were so superstitious that they would not leave their religious festival until there was a full moon. So they were of absolutely no help. It was a feast. Okay, Christy's correcting me. She said it was a feast, not a festival. But anyway, they wouldn't leave their feast, so they were going to be no help. So this is what Athens was counting on, help from like the ultimate grunt state in ancient Greece. Sparta was a military state, if there ever was one, and that's all they did is train for war. That's what they lived for. So, you know, they're the kind of guys you wanted on your side if you got into it. But they were not going to be there. So the Athenians were on their own, and they were outnumbered more than 2-1. It was probably more like 2.5 or 3-1. They were outnumbered at the Battle of the Marathon. Well, what happened was, and they met there where that's where the Persian army landed, which was 26.2 miles outside of Athens. And I say 26.2 miles, you might know what I'm getting to, because that's where the Olympic event, the marathon, got its name. And we'll see why here in a moment. But to make a long story short, which I'm bad at when I'm talking history, but to make a long story short, the Athenian commander came up with a plan, and it was outside the box because he was so outnumbered. So what he did is he put all of his best soldiers on the flanks rather than in the middle of the line, which was the traditional way to fight at that point in time. And as it turned out, his soldiers on the flanks worked their way in against an army that was much larger than their own. And when the dust literally, and I do mean literally dust, when the dust settled, what happened was that the Persians panicked because they felt like they were being surrounded, yet they still had the enemy outnumbered, and the Athenian army routed the Persians. And this was very unlikely, but it happened. I mean, this is one of those situations where truth is stranger than fiction. Well, the fear of the Greek commander at that time was that the Persian fleet would sail to Athens, which they could get to much more rapidly than the Athenian soldiers could on foot, and Athens was left totally undefended. So he sent his fastest runner, Phidippides, to go back to Athens and tell them, look, if they get there, we won, don't give up the city. So Phidippides ran 26.2 miles back to Athens, uttered the words Nike, or the word Nike, which means victory in Greek. How do you like that one, Matt? And then he keeled over dead right there. So the marathon event is something that's run in his honor because of the 26.2 miles that he ran back to Athens to let everybody know that the Greeks had won. Well, this was a tremendous victory. And when the Persians saw that the Greek city was defended, Athens was defended, and it really wasn't, but they put up phony barriers and made it look like they had the city defended, the Persian army sailed back home. So Athens had won this great victory. Now, in the meantime, before there was another major tussle between the Persians and the Athenians, well, Darius the First died. But every day, his successor, his son Xerxes, had someone remind him, and it was his job. One particular person had to remind him every day to remember the marathon. Even he whispered it in his ear every day, so he would never forget it. Well, a decade later, it was Xerxes that gathered up an even larger force of Persians, over 200,000 strong, and they invaded the Greek peninsula again in 480 BC. So this is the Xerxes who would have been the fourth, who was far richer than them all. Now, when we say that, the Persian Empire reached its greatest extent under Darius that we just talked about here moments ago. But Xerxes, his son, would have inherited that. And that when he said, when he shall be far richer than them all, he inherited everything his father had, which was a lot. His father actually had to break up the empire into districts. It was so large so that he could govern it more efficiently. So what this prophecy is saying, it plays out in history, in secular history, to a T. And so it was Xerxes then that put this force together and attacked Greece again. And this time, Athens did get help from Sparta, but the Persian army was so large that even with the help of the Spartans, the Battle of Thermopylae was a major loss for the Greeks. In fact, the Persian army devastated the city of Athens after that. They came in, they burned the Acropolis, they tore down everything, and it was a rout. And some of you might be familiar with the Battle of Thermopylae because that's the setting of the movie 300. The 300 Spartan soldiers formed into their military formation known as a phalanx, and they literally held off that army of 200,000 Persians in this narrow pass because they couldn't get through that spot and they could only fight a few at a time, and the Spartans were far superior in warfare. It wasn't until somebody on the Greek side tipped off the Persians that there was a secret way around the mountain pass where they came around the other side and surrounded the Spartans and their allies from both sides and ended up killing all of them. But at any rate, that's the famous Battle of Thermopylae. Now, when that was all said and done, afterwards, it looked like it was over for the Greeks. But according to Herodotus, who wrote a history of the Persian Wars, and Herodotus is considered the world's first historian. He's the first one who wrote secular history down. He's called the father of history. And some of his history wasn't quite accurate. So when he didn't have all the facts, he just kind of mixed in a little bit of mythology and other things, whatever made the story good. But according to Herodotus, basically, the Greeks figured out how to defeat the Persians when one of the Greek leaders visited the oracle at Delphi. And the oracle at Delphi told him to flee to the wooden walls. And he's like, what? Flee to the wooden walls? What? You know, and well, it turns out she was talking about his ships, which were made of wood. That was the answer. The Athenian navy was superior to the Persian navy. That's where you had to engage them before they landed. And so just one last note of secular history for verse 2 here. The Battle of Salamis was the world's first naval battle. It was fought on the heels of Thermopylae in 480 BC. And the Greek fleet of triremes were still outnumbered by these huge Persian ships, but they were much more maneuverable. And the Greek ships sunk most of the Persian ships. They got them into a narrow strip of sea, and they obliterated the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis. So this was the world's first naval battle, and the Athenians prevailed over the Persians. Now, this was far from over, but basically this kept Persia from overrunning Greece. The Persian wars would last for decades before Greece finally earned its independence for good. But this is the king of Persia. I know I just made a short story long, probably. Xerxes, that did what he stirred up all against the realm of Greece. And that fits to a T what happened, because they battled for decades after that. So that's the secular history that goes along with verse 2. Yeah, that's a pretty long verse after you talk about all that, I imagine, right? So does anybody have any questions or comments about that? Because I know I monopolized everything here, but I wanted to make sure I got those details in to prove the text, I guess.
Hey, Mike, is the Xerxes, is that the one that is in Esther? Is that the
Yeah,
same
it's
Xerxes?
believed he's the one that they call Ahasuerus. Yes, in fact, one of my references, even in the commentary, it said to see Esther 1 in verses 3 and 4. So it's believed that this is Ahasuerus from the book of Esther. Yes, very good. Thank you for bringing that up. I didn't have that written down here. Okay, but
That's what you were going to say. Oh.
so now we verse 3, when we get there, we fast forward quite a bit. We're going to fast forward about 350 years roughly to the time of a mighty king who's going to arise and rule with great dominion. And that mighty king is none other than Alexander the Great. And Alexander and his this next thing, I've had this up on a previous section of our notes that we had, but Alexander the Great's diadokoi, that means his successors. And this was after his death in 323 BC. Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. The reason I'm bringing this up, because Alexander conquered the entire Persian Empire by 331 BC, and that was within 5 years of becoming the leader of Macedonia when he succeeded his father Philip. And Alexander, of course, conquered virtually the known world at that time by 323 BC. So he was 32 years old when he died, and he had been fighting, he had been the leader of Macedonia since 336 roughly, upon the assassination of his father. And in that short period of time, he conquered the entire Persian Empire and then some. So he's the mighty king that arises. And if we want to trace this back to even into Daniel chapter 2, this is the bronze part of the image, the empire of Alexander. Now, we also see that his kingdom shall be broken and divided towards the 4 winds. Now, the 4 winds, in this case, I think that's interesting because there were 4 successors, his diadokoi, and we've talked about these 4 also. He did not leave his empire to his children or anything like that. In fact, they were eventually killed off, but his leading generals and those who fought under him, they were the ones who eventually inherited different parts of his empire. So it was split up among his generals, and because they fought it out amongst themselves to gain power in various regions. And now Ptolemy and Seleucus here, from this point on, they are going to be the focus for the rest of this chapter. Ptolemy and Seleucus. Whenever you see a reference to the king of the south, it's talking about Ptolemy and or his descendants. When you see a reference to the king of the north, it's referring to Seleucus and his descendants, because eventually of these diadokoi, these were the 2, along with, due to their descendants and so forth, that became the most prominent. And so as we move on into verse 5, it says, let's finish verse 4 here, where it talks about these kingdoms will be further uprooted. Okay, so the kingdom shall be uprooted even for others besides these. So there would be a lot of divisions in these kingdoms later on, but the kingdom of Ptolemy in Egypt would last longer than the others, along with that of Syria and Persia, which was dominated by Seleucids. So the Seleucids would be his descendants. And by the way, Ptolemy was, that was the Ptolemaic dynasty would rule Egypt all the way until 31 BC. And that it would end with the death of Cleopatra, as in Cleopatra from Mark Antony and Cleopatra fame. Because there were other Cleopatras before her. We're going to see that name here, but it's not the Cleopatra that you would normally think of, because that Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, she was Cleopatra the 7th, by the way. So anyway, so whenever we talk about the king of the south, we're talking about Egypt and Ptolemy. And whenever we talk about the king of the north, we're talking about Seleucus, and mainly Syria and or Persia. And that's for now in chapter 11. There's going to be a shift later on. In this part of chapter 11, that's who we're talking about, what we're going to deal with today. Okay, so verse 5 basically says that the king of the south will have great dominion, and so will one of his generals. Well, the king of the south is Ptolemy, and Seleucus, yes, at one time was one of his generals, and he would also have great dominion, and that would be in Syria and Persia. So that's who's being referenced there. So in other words, these became the 2 most powerful divisions in Alexander's former territories. Now, it says in verse 6 that the 2 kings shall join forces through a royal marriage. Now, what happened was that, and we can go ahead and scroll, Matt, because I've got this. So to make this a little simpler, I have this verse by verse kind of plotted out. I have the secular history in here verse by verse. So maybe it makes it a little bit easier for us to follow. So in verse 5, we have Ptolemy, once again, the king of the south, and Seleucus, the king of the north. In verse 6, Berenice, okay, was the daughter of Ptolemy II. So she is from the south, if you will, from Egypt. She got married to the Seleucid king Antiochus II. Now, what's interesting about this is that he had divorced his first wife, whose name was Laodice. And I see a mistake. Okay, good. Karen didn't edit me there. I have Antiochus II. Antiochus should be capitalized. I blew it here in English. But anyway, this Berenice married Antiochus II. Well, Laodice was the ex-wife of Antiochus II. And I thought somebody might ask me this, so I looked it up. And there are some who believe that Laodice is who the city of Laodicea was named after. Laodicea in the book of Revelation we read about. And that's one version. There's another version that said there was someone before her also named Laodice in the same family, that it might have been named after prior to her. But some believe she's the one who it's named for. So if that puts anything in some historical context there. But this ex-wife poisoned both of them. And so that was the end of that marriage. However, in verse 7, okay, as we follow, this is like a soap opera in secular history, which is predicted in the Bible. It's kind of fascinating, actually, and once again, very obscure but fascinating. Eventually, it says here in verse 7, from a branch of her roots, one shall prevail against the king of the north. Well, in verse 7, in what played out in secular history, Ptolemy III, who was the brother of Berenice, remember she was the one who was poisoned by Laodice, took territory away from the king of the north. The son of Laodice, that would be from the north, he lost territory to Ptolemy III. So there's the branch of her roots there, okay? So this can get really confusing because it's going to be, well, this guy's relative and her son or his niece or this person. So if you need to stop me anytime, feel free, okay? Because this becomes very confusing, and that there's a reason why I had to write all this down. It's as much for me as it is for you, quite frankly, because once again, this is very obscure history. So verse 8, wow. Okay, so it says, he shall carry their gods captive to Egypt and shall continue more years than the king of the north. So in other words, the king of the south is going to do well for a while. So Ptolemy III would return home and reign in peace. And I've written this in past tense, Ptolemy III returned home and reigned in peace. But once again, this is the secular history, how it played out. So if you look at verse 8, now, this is basically the fulfillment of verse 8. But obviously we don't have this in the Bible, but we do have it. We do have the secular history, and I feel very fortunate that the secular history is even available. And I have to give credit to the commentator here, Jim McGuigan, for providing this information. And I did some extra checking on some of it, but most of what I have here in this section, it comes from the commentator. And he had done an excellent job so far, but once again, everything else that I double checked on, which using the internet and so forth, it pretty much verified everything that he wrote here. So this is the summary of the information. And because I don't even know all the details, but I think there's enough here to show that, well, God's word is being fulfilled. Okay, so we move on to verse 9. So we've got a back and forth going on. There is definitely now a rivalry between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and this is going to continue for a time. Right now, the Seleucid king, verse 9. Here, let me read the verse first. Okay, it says, "The king of the north shall come to the south, but return home." Okay, so the king of the north, once again, that's the Seleucids. He attacked Ptolemy III, but not successfully. And as a result, he went home defeated. And that's verse 9 in a nutshell. So Ptolemy III who reigned in peace, was attacked by the Seleucids, but it didn't work out. Then we go to verse 10 and says, his sons shall stir up strife. Whose sons? The sons of Seleucus II would be engaged in war. And the name now we're going to be concerned with for the next 10 verses, basically, is Antiochus III. This is a big name. Antiochus III was also known as Antiochus the Great. And in ancient times, you don't get the nickname the Great unless you have literally won military victories. And he definitely did that. Not all the time, but he won enough of them to get the nickname. So Antiochus III, who, by the way, is the father of Antiochus IV, who we previously have talked about in other chapters, and we'll talk again about in this chapter next week, okay? There's a big difference. Antiochus III is Antiochus the Great. Antiochus IV, well, proclaimed himself to be God, manifest of God, but his enemies called him the madman. So anyway, but this was the formidable Antiochus. And now there are some that claim that the city of Antioch was named after this particular Antiochus. There may have been one or two Antiochs named after him. I say one or two because when I looked this up, I found out that there were other Antiochuses before him because he's Antiochus III, but there were 60 cities in that region named Antioch. So I thought Alexander the Great had an ego. He had 14 Alexandrias that he named for himself, but there were 60, according to what I just looked up recently, cities named Antioch at one time. So it's possible some of them could have been named for this man in particular, but it's also believed that Antiochus I was who most of them were named after. So another Seleucid. Okay, so in verse 10, Antiochus III begins engaging in warfare with Egypt again, or against Ptolemy. But at first, it's not working out very well. There's a very significant battle that takes place in 217 BC. It's the Battle of Raphia. It's also known as the Battle of Elephants. And I believe it's called that because that this was still a time when war elephants were a popular weapon for certain armies. And there are Alexander the Great actually came up against war elephants when he was in Afghanistan fighting against the forces of Prince Porus. And the Romans battled against war elephants when they fought in the Second Punic War against Hannibal. So this was not an uncommon. War elephants were very formidable until you figured out how to beat them. And it took centuries to figure out how to beat elephants. Turns out when they smell horse's blood, they go nuts and they're worthless. Or the other thing, war elephants, they move forward. I don't know. Karen wanted to know if they were afraid of mice. I said, not necessarily. But they move forward and they go straight, but they keep going. They don't veer to one side or the other. So if you move out of the way, they just keep going. So eventually armies figured out how to defeat war elephants, but that wasn't always the case, at least not yet. Alexander didn't quite have it figured out. He had his men run underneath them and cut off the belly bands that held the riders on their saddle. And when they fell off, then he had his javelin throwers go after the elephants without their riders. So they were more susceptible then. But anyway, so the Battle of Elephants took place here, and Antiochus III was defeated. Now, the next verse basically tells us, verse 12 though, it says, the king of Egypt's heart will be lifted up. He will cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. So he won the Battle of Raphia, but this was going to be short-lived because eventually what was going to happen, and I think this is what plays out in verses 12 and 13 and even 14, was Antiochus III was going to regroup. He was going to come back with a bigger army, and he was even going to get help from the Jews. And eventually he would prevail. Okay, as we get down to verse 15, Antiochus III was successful. And this is why he eventually has the nickname Antiochus the Great. So if we look at those verses in 13 and 14 and 15, once again, it's centering around Antiochus, but also there's mention of God's people in this, mention the Jews. So could I get someone to read just those 3 verses from 13 through 15? for the time being?
I can get that, Mike.
Thanks.
For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist.
Okay, so this is forecasting a victory, which is for Antiochus III, and that definitely happens. He prevails over the forces of the Ptolemies in Egypt, and he has help. There are Jews that join with him, thinking that this is going to be to their advantage. Well, it might have been temporarily, but when it says at the end of verse 14 that they will fall, they might have aided him, but eventually it was going to be to their undoing, because his son was going to be the one who wreaked havoc on the holy city of Jerusalem. His son, Antiochus IV, was the one that tried to Hellenize all of the Jews, and he basically outlawed practicing their religion. He took over the temple and desecrated it, even so much as covering it in pig's broth. And so, you know, when it's talking about their undoing, when it's talking about they will fall, it would be later. They thought they were making this alliance here that was going to be to their advantage, and they helped out Antiochus III, but it turns out it caused them a lot of heartache. Anybody have any take on that, as far as the Jews allying themselves with Antiochus III and paying for it later? What do you think the big issue was about the Jews helping Antiochus III?
Be a traitor, right?
Well, I guess a traitor to exactly what? I think that's
To their Jewish traditions and following God's will.
yeah, they're making alliances with a foreign country rather than relying on God. And, you know, that never worked out very well for the Jews when they did that. And it wasn't going to work out here either. So this is setting them up for something later that's not going to be pretty. So in the midst of all this talk of the king of the north and the king of the south, the Jews are involved in this also. Okay, Chris, did you have something there? I saw you light up there. No? Okay. All right, so we get to verse 16.
I'm sorry, Mike. I missed that.
Go ahead.
Just real quick, when you were asking about the Jews and everything, I was reading where they had heavy taxes by the Ptolemies, and they were tired of that. And you probably mentioned that. Maybe I missed it when I went to get my jacket, but that was one of the reasons that spurred them. They thought maybe the Seleucids wouldn't tax them as much, and that was their motivator. It was more of a money-driven kind of thing of, you know, if we're going to be in the middle of these two guys that constantly fight, maybe we want to be under control of the one that might be easier on us, and that and maybe not tax us as bad as the other one does. But Palestine was constantly in the middle of this, you know, and nobody likes to be in the middle of two people that are fighting. You feel like you're in a tug of war and everything. So I'm sure that this has been many years of being in this middle situation. I'm not justifying what they did, you know, and that, but I'm saying that might have been a motivator.
Oh, that's a good point. Actually, I didn't bring that up, so I'm glad you did. That's very good. That's aiding the conversation. That's very good. Now, once they were caught in the middle of this, I guess I don't know if you say, well, let's support the Seleucids. They won't charge as much taxes, against the lesser of two evils, or however that works out. But I think the problem was, and I think we can see this, is that they didn't put their faith in God. They put their faith in Antiochus III and his army at this time. And that was what led to their undoing. You know, I mean, couldn't you see this turning out differently if they just prayed about it and didn't make alliances that God didn't authorize? But that's not what happened. But this played out to a T because it was prophesied and it came true. Now, Antiochus III, once he gained power, he tried to kind of establish himself a different way. He tried to marry off his daughter to the Ptolemies. So he figured if he did that, and this was a very shrewd political move to a degree, if he could marry off his daughter to the Ptolemies, then he would have control of all of that. You know, just because he defeated them didn't mean he took control of their territory. He won a great victory, which meant now he was the top dog in the region, but he wanted to take it further than that. He wanted to consolidate the two kingdoms, if you will. His daughter was a Cleopatra, and once again, this is not the Cleopatra, you know, the most famous of all Cleopatras, but he tried to marry her off to the, Ptolemy V, who was just a boy at the time. I mean, he probably wasn't even high school age, I'm guessing, for our purposes. I guess the marriage was consummated, but it failed to provide any advantage. So his goal was, you know, the marriage for political advantage for his own, you know, benefit. It didn't work out according to plan. But that's what's being talked about here in verse 17. And I have a different version because I've got it's the version with my apocrypha, and it's the New American Bible. But my verse 17 says here, he shall set himself to penetrate the entire strength of his kingdom. He shall conclude an agreement with him and give him a daughter in marriage in order to destroy the kingdom. But this shall not succeed in his favor. Well, it didn't, because the marriage didn't accomplish what he had set out for it to do. But I mean, how awesome is this? You know, that prophecy right there in that one verse. You know, it's exactly what's going to happen and what the result of it will be. I mean, I don't know that there's any way you can mistake that. I know it's obscure history, but once you see that, is there any way you can mistake that for being a fulfillment of God's word? It's not mind-boggling because we know everything's possible with God, but it's just incredibly awesome, you know, just how this was fulfilled to a T. So, and that's usually the way God's word works, though. I guess when he says something, it comes true. But this is something I think that what I think about the book of Daniel, especially things like this, this is for the people that don't believe in the power of God and the all-knowing nature of God, and you know, just that he's in control of everything. And you know, this is powerful evidence. So, you know, fulfilled prophecy is probably, you know, Aaron likes to say this for every time. Fulfilled prophecy is like the number one proof of God's existence. And this is fulfilled prophecy. But not only that, it's not, you say, well, yeah, it's fulfilled in the Bible because the people that wrote the Bible were biased for God. Well, this is secular history and it's playing out just as God prophesied. So that's, to me, it's great for us. It builds us up, but that's evidence to try to convert the unbeliever. I mean, if they're still skeptical after that, well, they're not very sincere. So, okay, before we move on, anything else anybody like to bring up here? What time's it? 7:45. 7:45. Okay. All right. Chris, did you have something? No, okay. I saw your light come on and I figured it was okay. So verse 18, this is also still referring to Antiochus III. Verse 18, the one who looked like a man touched me again. And so, wait a minute, oh, sorry, wrong verse 18. That's what I get for not putting my glasses on. He shall turn to the coastland and take many, but a leader shall put an end to his shameful conduct so that he cannot renew it against him. Okay, now this is a quick chronology of some other places that Antiochus III attacked, and I think it talked about the coastland, so forth. Asia Minor, his forces attacked there in 197 BC. Thracia, which was next door to Macedonia, basically. He attacked in 196 BC, and Greece in 192 BC. Now, these are the places he attacked. Now, here were the results in general. Okay, Roman armies defeated him on both occasions. And by this time, Rome was a pretty strong empire. By this time, Rome had established itself as the powerhouse in the Mediterranean, and based on these years. So the places where he was defeated, one was at Thermopylae. Yes, that was in Greece, okay, by Acilius Glabrio, the Roman general, Acilius Glabrio. And then at Magnesium, and I believe Magnesium is also was also a Greek city-state, he was defeated by Cornelius Scipio in 190 BC. Now, I meant to double check this Cornelius Scipio because there was a Scipio in Rome, and there's a good chance he was either him or related to him, that played a major role in defeating the Carthaginian leader Hannibal. And the dates here, that Scipio could very well have still been alive. It might have been him or perhaps his son, at any rate, Magnesium. But anyway, these Roman armies, they basically dispatched the forces of Antiochus III. And that was pretty much the end of all of his conquests. And I think right here, when it says how he was stopped, well, that's how he was stopped, by the Romans. And they are not quite the powerhouse that they would become, but they were on the road to becoming that at this particular time. And so you could say in some ways, this was part of the Roman journey to becoming the world's mightiest empire. And they weren't necessarily an empire just yet. In fact, they were not an empire per se. They were powerful, but not as powerful, and didn't have as much as they eventually would have. That would come in the next century. Okay, so that takes us to verse 19. And eventually, Antiochus got into some financial difficulties. And apparently he was burdened heavily with some taxes. And I think it was related, I believe it was related to his defeat by the Romans, because usually they didn't just let you go. And there's a good chance he was paying indemnities to them. After he was defeated at Thermopylae and at Magnesium, there's a very good chance, and I'm sure it was the case, he was paying money to the Romans. So he no longer was the powerhouse force that he was when he had defeated Egypt. And he was short of money because he owed it to the Romans. So as a result, he lost his territory west and north of the Taurus Mountains. And basically, that was very valuable territory. And so in order for him to raise money, he had to resort to other means. So he went back to his homeland, which would have been specifically Persia at this time. And it turns out he resorted to robbing temples to try to gather up money. So that was the last of Antiochus III. So he came on with a bang and went out with a whimper, basically. He went from a mighty conqueror to a temple robber.
Hey, Mike, I have something interesting I was reading along with that, and you may have it too, I don't know. But it said when the Romans finally did make him sign like a treaty in that, they had taken his army and 20 hostages, including Antiochus the Epiphanes.
Oh yes, yes.
The fourth, and
You're
that,
right.
and they made him pay that large tribute at that time. And that's not only just like taking him down, but that like really takes him down. You know, when you were able to conquer and take, you know, some of his family and kind of hold that against him to kind of pressure him into doing what he did. So he fell quite a bit with that. I just thought that was kind of interesting. And you talked about all the drama and everything, you know, and that. So sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.
But he definitely met his match with the Romans at that time. And this would have an effect on Antiochus IV, because even though Antiochus III he died very humbly, if you will, because of what he had to resort to. Antiochus IV was always trying to live up to that, you might say, because his dad was the great. And so Antiochus IV, like I said, he nicknamed himself, which I think that's against the rules right there. He gave himself the nickname, So he was really trying to get out of his father's shadow. His dad cast a big shadow in spite of his failures at the end. Okay, now this last verse that I want to tackle today is the story of Seleucus IV and Heliodorus. And if you have a copy of the Apocrypha, and I need my glasses for this one, if you don't mind, I'm just going to read this, and this is what we're going to finish off with today. First, I guess, in verse 20, it says, well, here, let's back up to verse 19 just to back this up. It's talking about Antiochus III here. He shall turn to the strongholds of his own land, but shall stumble and fall to be found no more. So that's the end of him. Died a temple robber. And then verse 20, in his stead, one shall arise who will send a tax collector through the glorious kingdom, but he shall soon be destroyed, though not in conflict or in battle. Okay, now that in mind, this takes us to the second Maccabees, which is one of the books of the Apocrypha. And I have that here. We're going to look at second Maccabees chapter 3. And what time is it getting me? I'm going to read this for the time being. And then we'll, if we have some time left, we might get a little intro. If not, we'll save it for next week, because we'll probably end up saving it. So let's see, page 513. I had this marked. Page 5. Oh, here we go. Wrong way. 513. Oh, here we go. Okay, got it. Okay, so this is second Maccabees chapter 3. Okay, it says, while the holy city lived in perfect peace, and the laws were strictly observed because of the piety of the high priest Onias and his hatred of evil, the kings themselves honored the place and glorified the temple with the most magnificent gifts. Thus, Seleucus, here we go, king of Asia, defrayed from his own revenues all the expenses necessary for the sacrificial services. But a certain Simon of the priestly course of Bilga, who had been appointed superintendent of the temple, had a quarrel with the high priest about the supervision of the city market. Since he could not prevail against Onias, he went to Apollonius of Tarsus, who at that time was governor of Coelesyria and Phoenicia, and reported to him that the treasury in Jerusalem was so full of untold riches that the total sum of money was incalculable, and out of all proportion to the cost of the sacrifices, and that it would be possible to bring it all under the control of the king. So it's like, really, they got a lot of money there. So this is what sets up the mission of a man named Heliodorus. Okay, so basically what says a disgruntled official, a disgruntled employee, went off and kind of betrayed the Jews here and tried to encourage the Seleucids. Hey, look, there's lots of money here, and it's yours for the taking. Because he was upset with the ruler of the temple, so he turned on him. Well, we pick it up when Apollonius had an audience with the king. He's talking about the Seleucid king. He informed him about the riches that had been reported to him. The king chose his minister Heliodorus and sent him with instructions to expropriate the aforesaid wealth. So Heliodorus was to go, oh, okay, you got that? Oh, that's good. Okay, that's good. You got that up there. Thanks, Matt. So Heliodorus immediately set out on his journey, ostensibly to visit the cities of Coelesyria and Phoenicia, but in reality to carry out the king's purpose. When he arrived in Jerusalem and had been graciously received by the high priest of the city, he told him about the information that had been given and explained the reason for his presence, and he asked if these things were really true. The high priest explained that part of the money was a care fund for widows and orphans, and part was the property of Hyrcanus, son of Tobias, a man who occupied a very high position. Contrary to the calumnies of the impious Simon, the total amounted to 400 talents of silver and 200 of gold. He added that it was utterly unthinkable to defraud those who had placed their trust in the sanctity of the place and in the sacred inviolability of a temple venerated all over the world. So in other words, he says, we can't give this money because it would be unconscionable. You know, that's like, no, you can't, this isn't available for you, basically, is what he's telling him. So moving on here, he says, but because of the orders he had from the king, Heliodorus said that in any case, the money must be confiscated for the royal treasury. So he says, no, well, sorry, I've got my orders. So on the day he had set, he went in to take an inventory of the funds. Okay, now we get the reaction of some of the faithful Jews here. He says, there was great distress throughout the city. Priests prostrated themselves in their priestly robes before the altar and loudly begged him in heaven, who had given the law about deposits, to keep the deposits safe for those who had made them. Whoever saw the appearance of the high priest was pierced to the heart, for the changed color of his face manifested the anguish of his soul. The terror and bodily trembling that had come over the man clearly showed those who saw him the pain that lodged in his heart. People rushed out of their houses in crowds to make public supplication because the place was in danger of being profaned. Women girded with sackcloth below their breasts filled the streets. Maidens secluded indoors ran together, some to the gates, some to the walls, others peered through the windows, all of them with hands raised towards heaven, making supplication. It was pitiful to see the populace variously prostrated in prayer and the high priest full of dread and anguish. Okay, so you basically have that also in front of you there. So this is actually a pretty long chapter. How much time we got? Okay, we're almost at 8 o'clock. Okay, we'll be able to finish the reading and then we'll have to quit there and then we'll discuss it next week. So let's continue while we have that up there. So next section, my title says divine intervention. And so it says, yeah, the Lord protects his temple. So this is very interesting. And once again, this is not considered an inspired book. So we don't know if it's really true or not, but it sure is interesting, and it could be true. But nevertheless, I think if nothing else, if it's not completely true, even if it is not completely true, there's enough of it that would fulfill the prophecy in verse 20. So let's move on here. Okay, while they were imploring the Almighty Lord to keep the deposits safe and secure for those who had placed them in trust, Heliodorus went on with his plan. But just as he was approaching the treasury with his bodyguards, the Lord of spirits, who holds all power, manifested himself in so striking a way that those who had been bold enough to follow Heliodorus were panic-stricken at God's power and fainted away in terror. And you know, that's not far-fetched. If God was in on this, that's not far-fetched at all. So I mean, remember the Roman guards at Christ's tomb, how they were like dead men. Okay, there appeared to them a richly caparisoned horse mounted by a dreadful rider. Charging furiously, the horse attacked Heliodorus with its front hoofs. The rider was seen to be wearing golden armor. Then two other young men, remarkably strong, strikingly beautiful, and splendidly attired, appeared before him. Standing on each side of him, they flogged him unceasingly until they had given him innumerable blows. Suddenly he fell to the ground, enveloped in great darkness. Men picked him up and laid him on a stretcher. The man who a moment before had entered that treasury with a great retinue and his whole bodyguard was carried away helpless, having dearly experienced the sovereign power of God. While he lay speechless and deprived of all hope of aid due to an act of God's power, the Jews praised the Lord, who had marvelously glorified his holy place, and the temple charged so shortly before with fear and commotion was filled with joy and gladness now that the Almighty Lord had manifested himself. So Heliodorus had wished he had not done that, according to this. Now, once again, we don't know how true this is, but what we do know, this is something that God was definitely capable of. There's no doubt about that. And then the plot thickens a little bit more because Heliodorus is going to obtain mercy. And the people of God, the Jews, are actually going to pray for his recovery for him. And he is going to recover from those wounds that seem to would have been fatal under most circumstances. So when he recovers, the plot thickens even more. So we move on here. Verse 31, soon some of the companions of Heliodorus begged Onias to invoke the Most High, praying that the life of the man who was about to expire might be spared. Fearing that the king might think that Heliodorus had suffered some foul play at the hands of the Jews, the high priest offered a sacrifice for the man's recovery. While the high priest was offering the sacrifice of atonement, the same young man in the same clothing again appeared and stood before Heliodorus. Be very grateful to the high priest Onias, they told him. It is for his sake that the Lord has spared your life. Since you have been scourged by heaven, proclaim to all men the majesty of God's power. When they had said this, they disappeared. So I guess this is going to make a believer out of Heliodorus. So he's going to go back and he's going to make it known to Seleucus what the deal was. So it says, verse 35, after Heliodorus had offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made most solemn vows to him who had spared his life, he bade Onias farewell and returned with his soldiers to the king. Before all men, he gave witness to the deeds of the Most High God that he had seen with his own eyes. When the king asked Heliodorus who would be a suitable man to be sent to Jerusalem next, he answered, I love this, if you have an enemy or a plotter against the government, send him there, and you will receive him back well flogged, if indeed he survives at all. For there is certainly some special divine power about the place. So he says, send somebody, he's like, send somebody you don't like there, is what he told him. I just find that comical. It's playing out. Let's see, he says, he who has his dwelling in the heaven watches over that place and protects it, and he strikes down and destroys those who come to harm it. This was how the matter concerning Heliodorus and the preservation of the treasury turned out. Now, what eventually happened, Heliodorus ended up for expedience, he ended up murdering the Seleucid king after that. So that's all we have time for today. So we'll pick it up and maybe pick up some of the pieces of that next week. And I guess I timed that almost just right, maybe, to get through that. So we ended up just where I planned. So we'll wrap that up. Then we'll finish chapter 11, Lord willing, and then the following week, chapter 12. So we probably in 2, maybe 3 weeks, we'll wrap up the entire book. Okay. Let's see. Is mom still out there? I don't see him. Did they lag out? Okay. Nelson, would you lead us in a closing prayer?
Sure.